My name is Amy Domini, and I was a retail stockbroker in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1975. Now, that job description doesn't exactly exist anymore. Now, people who are involved in financial assistance to client bases are generally called consultants. But in 1975, stockbrokers sold stocks, not mutual funds. And each morning at 9 o'clock, what we called a boom box, a squawk box, would come up with a big announcement and would say, "We think that this particular company is an excellent buy right now. Here's the reason." And if you liked the reason, you would call your clients and say, "We think this is an excellent company to buy right now, and here's the reason." And I found myself occasionally getting pushback from clients in unexpected areas. So they would say to me, "They make weapons, don't they? No, I'm not interested in being part of a weapons manufacturer." Or they would say, "Aren't they a paper company? You do know I'm the head of the local Audubon Society, and I spend all my free time fighting paper companies and the dioxin they spray on our forests." And I began to realize, it's hard enough to find a client that wants to take your phone call. I didn't want to be introducing ideas that they found offensive when I finally got through to them. So I started the process in the getting to know you stage of a client of asking them, were there areas that they would rather not hear about my investment ideas? And it was remarkable when it was put as a positive question. Virtually everybody said, "Yeah, I suppose I wouldn't want to invest in something that actually hurts children," or that come up with a positive answer. And that got me thinking that I really needed to understand this aspect of the investment process. It's easy enough to listen to an announcement that such and such a company has a great shot of going up. It's a lot harder to know whether or not the client is inclined toward that idea. People tend to come to the idea of what I then called ethical investing because of a desire to not be at conflict with themselves, hopefully to be confluent with themselves in the investment process. The field of responsible investing in many ways has its roots in the national discontent that the Vietnam War introduced. It was an era that was kind of immediately on top of racial riots across America, and there were a combination of racial issues and war issues going on that framed a lot of the thinking of the first generation of those involved in the field. So the concerns tended to be primarily some sort of human dignity, universal economic justice efforts, and the methodology would shift. It would be focused on a population in South Africa or a population in sweatshops, or getting minority board members to board of directors, but that common theme of universal human dignity was one broad motion forward. The other broad motion forward was the planet, to have room on this planet for pristine spaces, and to have an understanding that using the planet was a wasteful action. So the specifics have ebbed and flowed, but always universal human dignity, ecological sustainability have stayed as core values for everybody in my field. Now, the Europeans call it something slightly different. They have what they call the triple P, people, the planet, profits, which is a nice confluence of ideas coming together in one simple phrase that I think is understood on first hearing. It doesn't take the explanation that socially responsible investing takes. from the start, and I wrote this in 1986 and my book was published, it had three core components. One of them was to buy stocks consistent, or buy whatever you're buying, venture capital, anything, consistent with a value set. The second was to be an active investor, to become engaged in moving the things you invested into to do more good. And the third was to support the grassroots organizations that are introducing capitalism to populations that have been left behind. And those three things defined our field and have now going on 35, 40 years. Since owners of shares are, in the real sense of the word, owners, they have an opportunity annually through a process to discuss with management at publicly traded companies issues that are not ordinary business. So you don't have the opportunity to go to General Motors and say, why on earth are you making cars? You know, that's ordinary business. That's what they do. But you do have the opportunity to go to General Motors and say, why are your cars not more fuel efficient? Or why is your board of directors not more diverse? And in fact, Ralph Nader, who was a well-known kind of corporate gadfly of the era, had done just that, had gone to General Motors, had a project General Motors, and had asked a series of questions using this mechanism. And as a result of that, there had been an African-American preacher elected to the board of directors of General Motors. His name was the Reverend Leon Sullivan. A year later, when the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, part of the Anglican Communion, also an Anglican church in South Africa, went to General Motors and said, it's immoral to be doing business in South Africa. You have factories there that are not raising the underdog. You should leave that nation. And the Reverend Leon Sullivan stood up and said, no, we can make a difference to the lives of people in South Africa. We'll start proving to the world that we can do it, and developed a code of conduct and asked other companies who had factories in South Africa to do all these things and make all these reports. And in a way, it kind of backfired. The reports proved that American corporations were doing jack in South Africa. So another effort got started, and that effort was shun and divest and humiliate the government of South Africa. So sports teams wouldn't go there, investors wouldn't invest there, cops wouldn't buy Ford Motor cars, and eventually the vote did come about in South Africa. Now that's kind of a long way of saying activism is tactical. You use the ability to address an issue to find a way to make that issue something that those of us who buy along standards can then assess whether or not you're consistent with our standards. And through the years, you've seen it be highly successful in these tough questions. The barriers that existed were, one, it wouldn't make money. So we created an index of our own, a corollary to the S&P 500. We didn't know if it would work or not work, but we figured if it didn't make money, we'd be able to say it makes 2% less or 1/8 of 1% less. Is it worth it to you to save the planet and all its people? As it turns out, that index has outperformed very significantly the Standard & Poor's. And I think that's because the biases you introduce when you buy with standards are for better quality management. The other barrier that was out there was whose values are in place here. You know, you say potato, I say potato. Who's the arbiter of values? I know that there's a Apple computer somewhere in the Defense Department. Where do you draw the line? And yet the few of us that were out there were really drawing the same line. We had a stakeholder process. We had the customer, we had the supplier, we had the investor, we had the workforce, we had the community. We were looking at all the stakeholders, and we were all evaluating the benefits and losses to the stakeholders in much the same way. So our answer to removing that barrier was to create and sell research that was definitional of what it was we were all looking at. And that worked. Then the third piece was to create demand at the grassroots. So we needed to get individuals asking for this kind of investing. Removing the barriers, that meant the legal barriers that didn't exist, but people thought they existed, you know. I mean, I'll just digress for a minute, but their classic legal barrier is you can't do something that's going to remove half the universe, of investable universe, because you'll clearly lose money, and you're a fiduciary and you're not allowed to clearly lose money. So the index proved that you didn't clearly lose money, but the theory did not go away. The theory remained that, you know, the hell with the facts, you know, you're clearly going to lose money. So we can't do it. Then you have to go to the legal community and say, what are the legal precedents and things? And the United Nations had an environmental program, and they got a hold of Freshfields. I'm going to stop there, it's a long name, a big international legal firm. And that legal firm did a global survey of whether or not it was legal to apply these things, and came out with the opinion that in most of the world it was not only legal but mandatory to make these considerations in the investment decision-making process. It still doesn't matter. You know, you still hear the it's not legal argument there, but we continue to try to remove these barriers at the top, whatever they are, whenever they come. So I have had a campaign that I've been a little less successful at, to have a much more full conversation on fiduciary obligation being to the whole person. If you run a pension fund, you can have an obligation to the pension fund, and that pension fund will make more money. But if that individual retiring is afraid to walk out in the evening and pick the child up at the school bus because of the neighborhood they live in, then you have failed your fiduciary duty. You've created such an unsafe structure that your beneficiary is worse off. So we need to have much broader conversations around what we mean by fiduciary. I feel that this is the beginning of the trend toward mainstream in every sense of the word. There will always be people out there who, you know, discover that they can lie, cheat, and steal, and they'll find a new way to lie, cheat, and steal, you know. But I do think that mainstream investment houses are increasingly understanding that it is going to be up to private industry, including their own industry, to address some of the universal issues that are out there. And you're starting to see it in things like lending. So you're starting to see standards by which banks make decisions about to whom they will lend money, and avoiding environmental catastrophes as a lending opportunity. That area is slow, but this is a very important shift that's taken place. So when you ask, what do I see the future? I see it as being far more universal. And then it hopefully will be able to creep into more of these financial things that are out there, these transactions that really don't have anything to do with getting me a meal or an article of clothing or something I desire. You know, they're just floating around, bets being floating around out there. And that'll be another whole battleground.